How did the economic system work 150 years ago? How did people earn their income and build their assets? These are two questions I thought we could dive into today. I often like to look back through history to see how people lived then, how society worked, to get a more clear understanding of my own life, and to also see how I can live an abundant life in today's society. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, Mark Twain wrote. And perhaps if we learn who other people in the past have handled their finances and earned their income, we can learn from their failures and successes to live a more abundant life today. We can also become more aware of and grateful for the unique opportunities that exist today for anyone to break out of poverty and start building wealth. This is something that was not part for most of human history, and recognizing this, we might make better use of our talents and grasp this opportunity. In rural Sweden, where I'm from, rich people used to live in large farmhouses. They typically owned large estate of forests, they owned land, maybe some factories or businesses like a sawmill or a wood wool factory. Oftentimes they also owned many houses which they rented out to other people. And rent was often paid in labor at this time. So in other words, they had multiple streams of income to their estate. And these people did not teach their children to go to work for other farmers. They taught them to manage their own estate and their own businesses. But the majority of people were poor and they worked for these farmers or landowners. The winters were long and tough, and they only had food that they had harvested during the fall. When the rye and the wheat were running out, they used to blend in a flour of ground bark to make it last longer. Their children typically received 3 to 6 years of schooling, and building any type of wealth or building assets were almost impossible for these people because all energy went to survival. They needed to work extremely hard for the farmer. And when that was finished, they went home to their small house that they rented, and then they needed to plant and harvest their own crops. Generation after generation stayed in poverty, and there was not so much they could do about it because all energy went to survival, basically. Most people in Sweden lived an extremely hard life, and this caused a third of the population to actually leave Sweden to go to the US. So what can we learn by looking back at this? Well, first of all, the quality of life, the general quality of life has increased enormously for everyone. So for several hundred years, there were minor changes in standard of living. And suddenly now, even a poor person can access a computer or smartphone and have information from anywhere. Another big difference is that it has never been easier than today for any person to break out of poverty and build wealth and create assets for themselves. A person born in a family without any assets and with low income can get a degree, start a business, and start building assets and change the trajectory of their family forever. They can go from being a worker to becoming an owner of assets. And this is an opportunity that is easily overlooked. Imagine if you could see all your ancestors and how hard they worked just to put you in this opportunity today. Another big change is that after 1980, the average person could start owning stocks. In other words, they could own shares of large businesses. And this is also a huge shift that has never happened any time before throughout history, that an average person could own part of large businesses and take part of the economic growth in that way. One big change I remember from my teens is when I could start order books in English. For a long time they were really difficult to get hold of because I used to type their titles in the search engine or in the search engine of the bookstore, but they did not appear. And suddenly one day they appeared. I could start ordering these books and start educating myself. They were shipped from the US, so it took several weeks for them to arrive, but still I could get hold of these books and start educating myself. I think the biggest opportunity of them all was when the internet became available to me when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And my mom signed me up for a course on building websites when I was a child. I wanted to build a website about one of my favorite games at the time, Worms 2. And when it was finished, I asked the instructor, how do I get people to be able to search for this? How do I get people to find it? How do I get it searchable in Google or Yahoo? And I remember the instructor, he looked at me perplexed, like he did not know the answer. So this is how early this was, that people didn't even know about search engine optimization. Using the internet to educate myself on different topics became a game changer for me. Long before any podcasts were available, I used to listen to the recordings of a course from Stanford University about entrepreneurship, and I listened to it over and over and over again. There was no YouTube channels about business, no internet gurus, nothing. So I listened to this course over and over again. So in 2012, I bought a course on YouTube marketing. So I started a channel and I created a course that failed. But getting started before most people in those really early days gave me a head start, and it really helped me to learn. So when online courses got really popular there in 2018 to 2020, and I already had a head start, and this time I succeeded. And these are opportunities that were not available to any of my ancestors. But if we use our curiosity, thrift, and dedication, we can really put them to work and change our life. In today's society, we can afford to try new things because the downside is quite limited. We can post a video online. If it doesn't work, not so much bad can happen. We can educate ourselves online, get hold of the best teachers in any subject, and these are opportunities that have never been available before. In my opinion, not using this advantage would be a great mistake. For example, my grandfather used to play the violin in an orchestra when he was young. And then he would go to a local teacher to take lessons. 2 generations later, I could take lessons from the best teachers in the world, take courses from top universities in the US, thanks to the internet. My grandfather, who later worked as a painter, had zero leverage in his work. He needed to lift heavy machinery to spray paint walls all day long, while I can record hundreds of videos that work for me day and night. So can you recognize the huge opportunity and advantage you have over your ancestors? Not using that would be a great mistake. And in my opinion, a modern world requires modern ways of working. So while the old farmhouse had surrounding factories and small businesses like sawmills, wood wool factories, etc. What would be the equivalent in today's society? How could we build something similar, but that would be up to date in our society? So if we look at the farmhouse from an economic standpoint, all the surrounding businesses and factories produced income. So we could produce something similar in today's society, like a YouTube channel, a brand, a business, or other types of assets that produce income to us. Now, we must remember a very big difference from 150 years ago and today. 150 years ago, all these assets were tangible, meaning they are built of wood and steel and bricks that you can touch. And that requires a lot of capital to start with. So in today's society, it could make much more sense to focus on intangible assets that could be created, because they don't require capital to start. They only require your skills and your creativity. Because 150 years ago, it was very difficult for the normal person to access capital to start one of these businesses. But today, you only need a computer or a camera or your phone, and you can get going. So in my opinion, in today's world, we should focus first on building intangible assets that produce income that we then can move over to tangible assets. So the big opportunity today lies in building intangible assets. So why make the effort to look at an old farmhouse or investigate how people lived 150 years ago? Well, to me, intangible assets we cannot see or touch. But if we can see these old factories, how they look and how they worked, we can then more easily start thinking how we could build the equivalent today. For me, visiting and seeing these physical old buildings made me think much more clearly about my own intangible assets today. So another big shift for me was the realization that I need to become an owner rather than a worker. The person who lived in the farmhouse, they owned the house, they owned the estate, they owned the forest, they owned the land, they owned the cows, the pigs. Most people rented houses from these farmers or from these landowners. And we can learn from this today. We can start to become an owner. We can start to create assets and buy other assets. In today's world, most people work in a company owned by a wealthy individual. Then they get their salary and then they go and buy products which are produced by a wealthy individual. And many people rent their home owned by a wealthy individual. So my suggestion is that we need to switch and start to become owners ourselves. We need to start own these assets. So many people in today's society are angry or jealous of wealthy people. And I can totally understand them, because for generation after generation, there was no opportunity for them to become an owner or create something of their own. They needed to work for these people, and there was no chance for them to improve their situation. I can totally understand if people have inherited this way of thinking from their parents and their grandparents. But in my opinion, this is not rational in today's society. It has never been easier to start creating something of our own than for this generation. Holding on to these old belief systems can, in my opinion, prevent us from making most out of this opportunity. It is like arriving at a party with a huge table of food, only to be so used to complain about the lack of food that we cannot even see the abundance there. I think many people are just so used to complain and just repeat the same old stories that have been told for generations. And then they cannot enjoy this smorgasbord of opportunity that is available to us today. I think most people would do so much better and increase their quality of life by letting those old stories go and making the most out of their talents and this opportunity that lies in front of us today. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you again next week.